Welcome, everybody, to COM 520, Strategic Communication Research. In this course, rather than lecturing you during our Zoom meetings, instead, I have created a series of lecture videos for you to watch, such as this one. So that is how I will deliver a lot of the course material to you, is through these videos. The first video here is about research paradigms and about the differences between quantitative and qualitative research. These are two foundational things when we talk about mass comm research. So whenever we do research, there are always certain assumptions that we carry into the research process. We may think that we're going into the research process with a completely open mind and a completely blank slate, but that is never the case. There are always certain assumptions that are sort of baked into the research that we do. And some of those assumptions are assumptions about human behavior, how people behave, how they respond to different situations, such as communication messages. So if we talk about human behavior, we might talk about two extremes: behavior that is 100% random and behavior that is 100% certain. On one end of the spectrum, we have something like flipping a coin, which is always 100% random because you never know if the coin is going to come up heads or tails. It's always a 50-50 chance. Even if you flip a coin 10 times in a row, and all 10 times it comes up heads, on the 11th flip, it's still a 50-50 shot, heads or tails. With something like gravity, gravity is a scientific law because it always holds true. It has never been disproven. If you throw an object up in the air, you know that it's going to come back down to Earth. So we can imagine plotting these on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is complete randomness and 10 is complete certainty. What if we bring in a field like meteorology, the science of weather? Is weather 100% random, or is weather 100% certain? Well, if weather was 100% random, then it would be pointless to even have meteorologists or weather forecasters, because we would never know what the weather is going to do tomorrow. It would always be a complete crapshoot. On the other hand, if weather was 100% certain, that would sure be nice, because then we would know exactly how much rain or exactly how much snow is coming tomorrow, and we could plan accordingly. But we know it doesn't work like that, because forecasts often turn out to be wrong. So meteorology would probably get placed somewhere between these two extremes. The only question is, would it be more towards the certain side or more toward the random side? And that's something that could be debated. What about mass communication or strategic communication, the focus of this course and this program? Is the way that people use, or the way that they respond to, mass communication messages, is it completely random, or is it completely certain? Well, if it was completely random, then the jobs of PR professionals or advertisers would be really difficult, because no matter what ads or what promotional publicity materials they created, they would never have a clue how people might react to those things, because it would be 100% random. So it would always be a stab in the dark. On the other hand, if we knew with 100% certainty how people respond to ads, or how they respond to, I don't know, press releases or brochures or videos or other communication messages, well, then we would know exactly, what to put in those messages, because we would know exactly how people would react. But we know that that's not true either, because different people sometimes react differently. There are all sorts of other factors that come into play when we talk about communication that influence people's behavior, things like history, their race, their gender, their social class, and on it goes. So mass communication is also, like meteorology, something that would fall somewhere between those two extremes. And again, the only question is, would you place it more towards the certainty end or more toward the randomness end? Depending on how you answer that question, well, your answer to that question, I should say, is probably going to influence the kind of research that you would do and the kind of research methods that you would use. If you're someone who leans more toward the certainty side, you're probably more of a scientifically inclined person, and you might be more inclined to use sort of scientific research methods. Whereas if you're someone who leans more toward the side of randomness, you're probably more of a, I don't know, creative, touchy-feely kind of person, and you're probably going to be more inclined to use more qualitative methods. So it comes down to, what exactly is mass communication? Is it subjective or objective? Is it interpretive or is it scientific? Is it unpredictable or is it predictable? Does it vary from one individual to another, or does it follow specific patterns? Is it all about making meaning and developing understanding, or is it about cause and effect relationships? Well, the answer, of course, is that it may be some combination of all of these things. But where you fall on these scales is going to determine the kinds of research methods that might be the most appropriate. So I said that there are always some assumptions baked into research, and those assumptions are part of what we might call research paradigms. There are several research paradigms, but I'm only going to mention two of the most common ones that you are responsible for understanding. And those two research paradigms are the positivist and the interpretive paradigm. So what is a research paradigm? Well, a paradigm provides a viewpoint or a set of assumptions that frame the research process. When you go into doing a research study, you are always making some assumptions about behavior, some assumptions about measurement, and those assumptions form paradigms. So let's talk about the positivist versus the interpretive paradigm, starting with the positivist paradigm. Now, this is a paradigm that is very much in sync with the scientific method. So if you see research as being something that's very scientific in nature, you would probably gravitate toward the positivist paradigm. And someone who calls themselves a positivist believes that there is an objective reality. There is something out there that we can all more or less agree upon, that is tangible, that is objective. If you're studying a concept like intelligence, a positivist would say that intelligence is something real and objective that we can all agree upon and that we can all measure. So, positivist believes that reality is objective. And that objectivity will also carry into the research that they do. So a positivist believes that when they are conducting research, their relationship with the subjects that they are studying should be one of objectivity and detachment. In other words, the researcher should not let his or her own opinions or biases cloud their research. They should essentially be a neutral, detached observer. And if you use a research method like a survey, for example, you have that objectivity and that detachment, because you can simply send an email link to a whole bunch of people and ask them to take the survey. They take the survey all by themselves on their own time. You're not watching them while they're taking the survey. You're not hovering over them. You're not telling them how to answer the questions. They answer the questions on their own and they submit the survey. So you, as the researcher, are very detached from the whole process, which allows you to maintain your objectivity. Someone who's a positivist oftentimes studies cause and effect relationships between variables. How does one variable influence another? For example, what is the influence of social media use on someone's self-worth or self-image? Okay, that's a cause and effect relationship, where you would measure how often someone uses social media, you would measure their self-worth or self-image, and then you would see what the relationship is between those two things to determine whether there's a cause and effect relationship. The ultimate goal of positive research tends to be prediction or control. So if I know the relationship between social media use and self-worth, then I can make predictions. I can say that if an individual spends 20 hours a week on Instagram, that their self-image is going to decrease by 5% or something like that. I can actually make a prediction, which also makes it easier for me to control people's behavior. So that's the positivist paradigm. What about the other paradigm that I mentioned, the interpretive paradigm? So someone who considers themselves an interpretivist would begin with a view of reality as being very much relative or socially constructed. So an interpretivist would argue that there is no one objective reality that we all can agree upon. Instead, reality is something that each of us construct and perceive in our own individual ways. My reality is different from your reality. The reality of a straight white male might be different from the reality of a gay black female. We all bring our own unique perspectives to bear on reality. So an interpretivist, when they're conducting research, rather than trying to be detached and objective, an interpretive researcher instead actually wants to get kind of down and dirty with their research subjects, talk to them, observe them, and interact with them. A classic example of this would be an anthropologist who travels to study different cultures, different groups of people. The anthropologist might actually live with that group of people for a period of time, immerse themselves in that culture, observe those people, talk to them, interact with them, basically become part of that group for a period of time. And the argument goes that it is through that interaction that they're able to better understand the research subjects they are studying. So an interpretivist is not going to be so much interested in things like cause and effect relationships. Instead, an interpretive researcher is more interested in understanding people's culture and cultural artifacts, things like symbols and actions and rules, and that ties in actually very well with communication, because communication is all about symbols and actions and rules. And the ultimate goal of an interpretive researcher is not so much about making predictions or controlling people, but rather just developing a very rich and in-depth understanding of people and their cultures. So those are two of the key paradigms. And you're probably thinking, well, do I have to pick one? Because they both seem to have their pros and cons. Obviously, you don't have to pick one. You can kind of live somewhere in between those two. I think there are very few researchers who would say they align 100% with one paradigm or another. It is okay to see the value in both of those paradigms and sort of live somewhere in between those two extremes. So those two paradigms also map well to quantitative versus qualitative research. The positivist paradigm is more associated with quantitative research, and the interpretive paradigm more associated with qualitative research. Another way to think of it is being almost kind of like the left brain versus right brain. So you see on one side, you've got quantitative, which is more objective, deductive, deals with numbers, is generalizable. On the other side, you've got qualitative, which is more subjective and inductive, not generalizable, and is more focused on words. So let's take a minute here to talk about each of these two sides. Let's start with quantitative research. Now, obviously, it is called quantitative because it involves quantities, which means numbers. Okay, so quantitative research assigns numbers to variables. Whatever it is that you are trying to study, whether it is bias or it is corporate social responsibility or it is social media usage, you are going to find a way to measure that and assign a number to it. That's what quantitative research is all about, numbers and statistics. And it strives for objectivity, so using the scientific method. Quantitative research often involves studying a large sample, meaning a large number of people or items. For instance, when you do a survey, you might have 500 people respond to your survey. That's not at all uncommon. So quantitative research is often about breadth, reaching as many people as possible, large sample sizes. And quantitative research is often used to generalize and to make predictions. When I say generalize, what do I mean? Well, what I mean is making broader conclusions about the overall population based on what you have found to be true for a smaller sample. So if you're doing a survey, and maybe you're doing a survey of graduate students, okay? And you administer your survey to 500 graduate students. Generalizing means you are saying, well, based on what I found to be true among these 500 graduate students, here is what I can therefore conclude about the overall population of all graduate students. That's generalizing, going from that smaller sample to the overall population, and then being able to also make some predictions based on that. So that's quantitative research. What about qualitative? So qualitative research tends to be much more subjective. In fact, a qualitative researcher would probably say there is no such thing as true objectivity, that we're all, by our very nature as human beings, subjective. Qualitative research tends to rely more on interpretation or observation rather than measurement. So it doesn't try to take all of those abstract concepts and turn them into quantities or numbers. As a result, the findings of qualitative research take the form of themes rather than statistics. So if you're doing a study where you are observing the day-to-day operation of public relations firms, over the course of your observations, you probably start to notice certain patterns or certain themes that emerge. Those are your findings. Your findings are those themes rather than numbers or statistics. Qualitative research aims more for depth rather than breadth. So qualitative research tends to study a much smaller number of people or items, but studies them in a lot more detail or depth than is possible with quantitative research. So those are the distinctions between quantitative and qualitative, which, as I said, also kind of map with the differences between the positivist and the interpretive paradigm. In this course, we are going to specifically talk about 3 research methods. 2 of them are quantitative, surveys, and content analysis, and 1 of them is qualitative, and that would be focus groups.